Hello.
Hello, Martin. It's Alf. How are we all doing?
Good. How are
Good, and
you?
you? Hello.
Hello, Benoit.
Hey.
We've got a few more of us hopefully joining soon.
Give people another minute and then we can get started. All right, I think we can get going. Welcome to the GraphQL Nullability Working Group meeting. I hope everybody here has agreed to the membership agreement and has added themselves to the agenda. Quick round of introductions of the attendees. I'm Alex Riley. I'm here as an independent.
Hi, folks. I'm Benji from Graphile.
Hey, Benoit from Apollo.
Everyone, I'm Kelvin. I'm also from Apollo.
Hi, I'm Itamarin from Meta.
Hey, I'm Alf. I'm from SICT, but as an independent.
Hey, I'm Ernie. I need to add myself to the agenda, but I'm Ernie from Coinbase.
And I finally found a place to make my call, so I'm Martin from Apollo.
Great. Do we have a volunteer for note taking? It should not be Benji. Benji has a lot of agenda items today. I guess I can do it. Is there a link to the notes somewhere? Oh, I found
Yeah,
them.
I'll
Found
paste
them.
it in the chat again, but it is linked in the agenda as well.
Great.
I have spent a moment setting up the notes file, so it should be good to go.
It doesn't look, I don't think we don't have any action items. Da, da, da. Quick review of the agenda. Benji is going over the nullability trifecta, and then Benji is going over GraphQL-tow. And then Benji is going over an early implementation in GraphQL JS. And then shocker, Benji is going over incorporating GraphQL toe in the GraphQL JS pre-release just asking about integrating into the blog post. Okay, cool. With you wanna get going, Benji, on the trifecta?
Yeah, can do. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add to the agenda before I eat up all of the time? No, it seems fine. Okay, let's go. Okay, so I've I've been doing a lot of thinking about nullability. Partly because of GraphQL Conf as usual, partly just because this is the kind of thing that I think about. Hello, cat. Sorry about my cat being noisy. And yeah, it seems like we effectively have three parts of our currently proposed solution, some of which can be used on their own, but when we pull them together, when we use all of them together, that's when we get the biggest benefits. So just to break them down, one of them is the client side ability to do special error handling. So effectively the ability to mix those errors that come, you've got data and errors, it's to mix those errors back into the data somehow. The simplest of which is to throw on error. Which is the behavior that I think Relay allows you to opt into now on a per fragment basis, which is great. There is no null bubbling. No null bubbling is not really intended for end users. It may be useful for some like simple command line scripts that don't care about errors under any circumstances, but it's primarily intended for things like Relay, Urkel, Apollo Client, basically anything with a normalized cache, because writing your errors to a normalized cache gives you various problems. And then if you combine one of those previous things, doesn't matter which one, suddenly in fact, you don't even need either of them. You can just do it on its own. There's semantic non-null. Semantic non-null letting you say that this thing is null only if an error occurs, which is particularly useful when it is tied with one of those two previous techniques. When we tie them all together, though, we give our end users a really beautiful experience, I think. What I'm expecting at the moment is that end users won't need to think about these different types of nullability. If their client, Relay, Apollo, Urkel, whatever, uses the no null bubbling, and their client also does the localized error handling, then the client can expose anything that's semantically non-null as if it was just non-null. Effectively, semantic non-null and strict non-null, the difference is whether there can be an error there or not, or a null. For a strict non-null, a null or an error cannot occur there. It has to blow up the selection set, so it would occur somewhere else. If we take errors out of the equation by effectively throwing them up front, then both semantic and strict non-null become non-null. So now regular users are just back to thinking about nullable or non-null. And I think that's going to be a really beautiful experience. So this is what I'm calling the trifecta. And any thoughts? All right, no thoughts. Let's move on. So following GraphQL Conf, and excited by what the Relay team have brought out, I've introduced a new project. It's an incredibly small project, like, I don't know, 100 lines of JavaScript, something like that, called GraphQL Toe, or GraphQL Throw on Error. The idea behind this is literally it should work with any client that just uses the raw like response data, whether it reconstitutes it or what. If it gives you data and errors, then we can combine them using the power of JavaScript and getters to make it so that if you ever read from a field that had an error associated with it, then that error will be thrown. And because that error is thrown, that means you can never read an error from it because it would be thrown instead, not a read. And that means that you can now leverage things like try catch or react error boundaries or whatever your regular error handling techniques are for handling those errors. So as you remember, that's one of the pieces of the trifecta. Now, Relay itself wouldn't, I think, support this, but of course it's got built in now throw an error. So this, I think, GraphQL Toe project should theoretically mean that Apollo client, Urkel, and even things like grapl, various just simple GraphQL clients should be able to leverage this. Even window.fetch should just be able to take the data and errors from the response that it's got in the JSON, feed it into GraphQL Toe, and now you have a throw an error behavior, and you can start experiencing this new paradigm for writing GraphQL code, reincorporating the errors back into the tree. I open the floor again.
I guess the one thing I certainly kind of looked at that project and dug into a little bit. I think maybe a question like that has no that concept is simplified enough that it's not as if you know which fields can throw an error, right? Like it's always possible anything could throw an error, and like because there's nothing there'd be nothing in the schema that would designate that, right? But I mean, maybe that's like not what we want. Is that like you're kind of making it such simplified such that like anything could throw an error that's for you to deal with and handle as the client consumer. Is that true?
Yeah, so just like in GraphQL in general, any field can error. If it were a strict non-null field, if it were a strict non-null field, then the error couldn't occur in that position. It would occur in a parent, but you'd never have that in your data anyway. So yeah, technically anything can throw an error, which, as you say, like actually matches the GraphQL behavior. And it's one of the things that Lee said that I think Nick said, Stephen, on your panel talk. He said something like, anything can go wrong at any time for any reason. Something like that, I think it was, paraphrasing. So yeah, this essentially acknowledges that. And in fact, I think it even makes it so that if the entire response has failed, i.e., data itself is null or not present, then it will just immediately throw an error as well. So yeah, it handles all of the different levels. It does not have any restriction where you can say, please don't throw an error here. That's your job to wrap it with a try catch or something like that.
And I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but just to clarify, like, and there's also nothing in there that would let you like give it like a path and say, is there an error here? Like the only way to tell if there's an error is like try to read it if it throws, right? There's no like, there's no ability. I mean, like obviously you could inspect it, look at errors, and like figure that out yourself. Of like, hey, the response from the server has a path, which is this, But have you thought about like, is there any reason to add that where like you can have the ability to like look up like, is there an error at this field for any reason, or does that just seem unnecessary and like
I don't see a need for it yet, but maybe if people start using it, they'll find that there is one. You do still have the errors. You need the errors array to throw into Toe anyway. So you technically already have a list of all the paths. One thing that I can see this being expanded on in future is supporting like fragments. So at the moment, it just works at the root level. What I really wanted to do was integrate it with something like use fragment. But the main issue with use fragment in, for example, GraphQL CodeGen is that it just takes in data and just returns the same data. It doesn't know what the path is. And because it doesn't know what the path is, we can't know which errors to apply to it. So it would need to be in a more knowledgeable system for this purpose. But by just doing it at the root, of course, when you do a use fragment later, you'll still get this same error behavior. So yeah, essentially it's just it's saying errors can happen anywhere at any time for any reason. Let's throw them and you use your regular programming capabilities to deal with this. If you're rendering in React, use your error boundaries. If you're doing something else, use try catch, which we should be doing anyway. So
Yeah, makes sense. It was just kind of a curiosity because like we had built something internally that lets you kind of look up that information, that error information, basically say like, hey, like, is there an error here before trying to access it or whatever, just so you could deal with that differently. But yeah, that's certainly easy enough for someone to write. But it's maybe future ergonomics for that library potentially if people think they need it. But that's how you end up with scope creep and library floating. So
the main aim for this, I think, is to, I forget, it's a shame Jordan's not here. I forget what Jordan calls it, but essentially never to read a null and think it's a null when actually it's an error. Because at the moment
yep.
you have to do, like you say, you have to manually check and say, is there an error at this path when I read a null? And this just makes it so if there is an error, it will throw anyway. So you can never make that mistake of saying, oh, I don't have a best friend at the moment, rather than, oh no, I failed to fetch my best friend.
Yeah,
To quote
no results found.
Jordan's quote.
I think he called it like true nullability or something like that.
Could be. Okay, cool. So the main thing that I would like here is it would be nice if people tried this out, if they tried it in projects, if they maybe encouraged users to try it out as well. It's an incredibly simple library. So yeah, I think this would help to get more feedback quicker on the whole direction that we're going with the nullability working group at the moment. Give us a feel whether this is the right kind of thing. That's my hope. Without having to have native library support. Calvin.
I'm thinking of this in the context of Swift and Kotlin, and I don't think I would implement this to be every field throwable. The ergonomics of that are just going to be not very good. I think I would want them to tell us in the operation which field specifically they want to throw on error. And then we make, because they require a specific getter, so that one field would get it, obviously.
So I think the way that Relay handles it, and I might be wrong on this, is that they effectively do it at a fragment level. So you opt into the error handling there. We don't know, GraphQL doesn't know anything about fragments, doesn't really know anything about GraphQL, if I'm honest. It just knows his data and his errors. Let's tie them back together again. So yeah, it's very much like JavaScript / TypeScript designed, and that is it. I'm not expecting it to necessarily work in other environments. I think other solutions that are more suited to those environments would work better there. But essentially, the problem with opt-in, again, is there's always that risk of reading that null and thinking, oh, this is a null, when actually it's an error. And there's really no way to protect against that other than to reincorporate the error into your tree somehow. For example, making it so when you read that, you don't read a null, you read a literal error object. It doesn't have to be thrown, could just be a class, an instance of. There's a whole, or make it so that you have to read everything as a as a result object. User.username, is that success or error for every single property? But that could also be quite cumbersome.
Yeah, I think the general thing is the same. We don't have the same kind of error boundaries that React or Relay does, but I think the general premise is the same. But yeah, I get your point about opt-in. Okay.
Cool. Thank you for the feedback. Okay, moving on. I have also hacked out a early implementation of what we're currently proposing in GraphQL.js. Now, to be clear, it's not a precise implementation of everything. So, for example, it does not implement the document level directives. It goes back to using the asterisk syntax. So just because it's a lot easier to add the asterisk syntax than it is to tell the parser to flip between two different modes depending on whether a particular directive is present, and so on and so forth. But essentially, this gives us the ability to actually start playing with GraphQL semantic non-null as a type in the GraphQL.js reference implementation. It does add the representation of this to introspection, not necessarily in the right way. It does it in a way where you can read it and you can get your answers, but it's, again, not necessarily the correct final names for the various fields, or even the correct shape necessarily. Like, there's some things I'd like to discuss with the group there, which I guess now would be a good time to discuss, actually. But yeah, so essentially it gives syntax support, it gives the non-nullability support, it gives I think it gives the opt-out of null bubbling support as well. Yeah, it basically makes the behavior work correctly, adds the introspection, and adds this new type and a representation for it. And also, since then, and since I filed these issues, I've created another project called GraphQL SOC. GraphQL SOC effectively gives you a way to convert between, I'm going to put it into the chat here. GraphQL SOC gives you a way to convert from a schema that supports semantic, and thanks to Iha's work, it supports both the @semantic non-null directive and also the asterisk syntax from the GraphQL.js implementation. And it will then allow you to output it either with the semantic types stripped entirely, so as if they never existed, or with the semantic non-null types converted into strict non-nulls. So when I was discussing the trifecta earlier, if you opt into all of these things, what you actually want is all of those semantic non-nulls to be converted to strict non-nulls. And if you then do that, you can feed that into your GraphQL code generator or something like that, and you get this experience that we want to give people. So GraphQL TOE, GraphQL SOC, and the new GraphQL.js, if you use all of these together, then you can experience this lesser need for non-null checks across your schema, is my hope. Pause for feedback, and then we can move on to the various questions I have for the group.
Is there, wasn't able to make it to GraphQL Conf. Like, maybe this is part of this separate conversation, but more like the syntax of like going back to asterisk, or asterisk instead of like the double exclamation point stuff. Is that like more of an official decision type thing? Is that just like we got to pick something and let's just go forward type? Okay, cool.
I wrote it in the airport whilst I was waiting for my plane.
Yeah.
And it was just faster to just
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah. Makes sense. Cool.
We're gonna have
That
another
said,
20 minutes or so after, if the agenda is right, so we can talk about syntax afterwards as well. You're saying, Benji?
okay. Yeah, cool. That said, especially with I know Martin, for example, is keen that the I'm not sure if this is still true, Martin, but last time we spoke, you were keen that the SDL that the server uses and the SDLs that the client use would be the same. As I've described on this call, I think that it's generally better for the user to only deal with the null and the non-null. That said, if we do decide that it's better to also tell users about the semantic non-null as well, if they're using something like GraphQL throw on error, there's really like no difference between the semantic and the strict non-null. But we may or may not want to use a more stable syntax for that. And I think we've got two options there. One is to go with the question mark blank bang. One is to go with blank asterisk bang, which keeps our existing syntax and just adds asterisk as a new thing, which is what it is. Or potentially to go with what was previously proposed with the blank bang and then the double bang, all of which are still options. So yeah, I've implemented asterisk just because it's the easiest of them to implement. And everything basically keeps its existing meaning. And then the new thing comes in as a new symbol. But we can definitely visit doing any of those. Okay, I'm going to open it to some interesting discussions that I sort of came up with whilst implementing this. And part of this, and you may have read this already in chat, is when I was discussing this before, I was thinking of it in terms of what the request mode was. Like, oh, the request mode is going to be turn off null bubbling. So therefore, all of the strict non-nulls are equivalent to semantic non-nulls. Or the request mode is traditional mode. So we can't give them semantic non-nulls because they won't understand what they are. And it could cause the client to throw an error, or the tooling most likely that you would be using to introspect the schema to throw an error. So let's convert them to nullable and only let them opt in if they want to. But thinking about it more from a point of view of how are people actually going to be using this, I think that can someone else take over the notes, please, says Alex. I think that one of the main ways of using this system now will be this trifecta approach. And again, it doesn't have to be the throw on error. It's just some kind of inlining of errors so that there is incorporation of that into your coding. And if you were to do that, then what you would want from introspection is effectively more strict non-nulls. The semantic non-nulls are actually not that useful for you. They're accurate and true. Semantically, this can be a null, but only if an error happens. And that's true of every field can be null if an error happens, if you've turned off null bubbling. So do we want to opt into that and actually tell people that it is strictly non-null, which keeps us with that, which basically means that that old style of syntax, the blank and the bang, just falls out of introspection in this new mode because you've said, I as a client want to run things in this particular way, rather than saying run this connection in this way. It's more of an indication of intent. So I thought that was interesting because it would mean that by just adding this one flag on the request, everything else just works as it would traditionally have worked in GraphQL. Like the introspection results would be the same. The null bubbling results less so, but you've opted into that. So that was, let's stop on that question for a moment, if anyone managed to pass what I was saying. I feel like I may have hashed up the
So
explanation
trying
of that.
to take notes, I am still a little confused. So I believe what you said is that by disabling null bubbling on the request, then every field can be null, and we don't really, there is no observable difference from semantic non-null or strict non-null because the field can be null. And you have said that you can handle this.
Yeah, so that's correct. And that is essentially what the previous state of this was. So technically everything becomes semantically non-null, which if you imagine the new syntax would mean you wouldn't see any bangs anywhere. You'd only ever see asterisks. And what I'm saying when I was thinking about this, when I was implementing it and doing the GraphQL toe and the GraphQL sock, is actually what might make more sense for the user is rather than giving them back a whole bunch of semantic non-nulls, asterisks effectively in this current syntax, let's give them back the bangs that they used to have. Let's give them back the strict non-nulls. They are telling me, I don't want you to not to bubble these nulls, and I will be handling all of these nulls in line anyway. So previously it was just please don't bubble the nulls was the request, so we'll give it back semantic. And I'm saying maybe the request shouldn't be please don't bubble the nulls, and it should instead be I want to handle the errors on the client side. That is my plan. Don't handle the errors. I'm going to do that. In which case the server can say, sure, okay, here are all the, if you're handling errors in this way, then here are all the positions that will never be null. They may be errors, but they'll never be null.
In
So
this scenario,
effective.
In this scenario, the syntax then wouldn't change at all, right?
Exactly.
Just they're like a flag on the request, essentially.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's one of the great things about it is if you can then opt tooling into this, then they can get back this schema with more bangs in it, and they can generate nicer types for users, and everyone's happy, is my hope. Though it is technically a lie. Or is it? Because all of the introspection says is non-null. It doesn't say strict non-null or semantic non-null. It says non-null. So we could say that's an ambiguous non-null, or that's a non-null that is request dependent, depending on which flag it's in. It just was an interesting like difference of thought than what I had previously thought about. So I thought I'd mention it.
Does that ambiguity like become a problem if you're just like looking at like if you're pulling up like graphical playground, right? And it's like you want to look at this field and it's like, well, you don't know the difference between what it is defined in the schema itself based on the result you're sending, right? Like does that ambiguity become like a problem just maybe from like purely a documentation perspective, not like a runtime like how it actually behaves, but just like a hey, like I have no idea if this field is truly null or that kind of thing, I guess, right? Do you think that's an issue?
I don't think that graphical particularly is an issue. It's a good point. I think graphical would probably have a toggle between effectively, I'm going to call them just old mode and new mode,
Yeah.
for the purposes of this call. And effectively, everything at the moment runs in old mode, but graphical can have a toggle that says new mode. And then when it gets a response back, it can be like, the server sent it in old mode anyway, so we're in old mode. Or, oh, we're in new mode. Here's the new stuff.
Yeah.
Where I do think it would be an issue is if a piece of tooling runs in new mode, gets the introspection results in new mode with these non-null bangs, and then just represents that as SDL, and then tooling or some other client reads it and trusts it, and actually a whole bunch of those things are semantic non-nulls.
Yeah.
And if it's not running the request in the new mode, it's running it in the old mode, then the assumptions will be broken. So
Yeah.
arguably this could be represented with something like again a document directive, like just right at the top, this is semantic at semantic, and then the rest of it is fine, or something like that. There's options. Um, I'm not sure what the correct solution is there because this is
Yeah.
something I came up with quite recently.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to think through like all the implications of it downstream, right? And so I think that like, yeah, like it would like take some time to like try to noodle on it for a little while to try to like understand what's going on there. But it certainly feels like that there's potential foot guns there. Because like specific, I'm thinking kind of specifically around like the type gen stuff where it's basically like you get this thing and you're like, oh yeah, okay, great, all these things are definitely not knowable, and it's like, well, that's because you did it wrong, like as far as like the request mode and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, the hope would be that you would have your client and your code gen configured the same so
yeah,
that if your introspection would run in the mode that your client's going to run, and code gen just trusts what it's given and just outputs basically what it's given. And that way, so long as the introspection and the client are the same, it doesn't actually matter what code gen does, because it's the client that ultimately needs to make sure that the assumptions are true. So that's my kind of hope is if the client does the introspection, gives that schema that's full of bangs to CodeGen. CodeGen says all these things can't be null, and the client's like, "Yeah, no, this is great because that's what I've opted into." Then I think it's fine. But if that schema gets used anywhere else than code gen that goes back into that same client, that's when things become problematic. So yeah, they're, as you say, potentially foot guns there.
Yeah.
Stephen.
It does make sense that, if you're in new mode, all you really care about is if something's nullable or not, and you understand that we're in like semantic world or whatever. But would it to alleviate the ambiguity between, or potential ambiguity with something that was non-null in the old world versus slightly different definition of non-null in the new world, uh, if we reversed it and in the new world we just tell you these are the things that are nullable? Because in old mode that doesn't, we don't explicitly say that something's nullable because we just say it's not null. So in the new world, it's providing exactly the same information. It's just, we're providing the inverse of it. Um, but it's unambiguous because in the old world, we don't provide that information that, that something is nullable. Uh, but it's still something that is simple, because it's still just a, binary. Is this nullable or not?
Yeah, and your SDL goes from effectively blank and bang to question mark and blank.
Yeah.
It's definitely an option, and I know that that particular syntax is one that quite a few people are keen on. I have concerns that making an unadorned type means something different than what it has traditionally done is super confusing. Saying
Yeah.
if you're running it in old mode, then unadorned means it's nullable. And if you're running it in new mode, then unadorned means it's not nullable. To me is just a non-starter. But I know that quite a lot of people are actually like, nah, it's fine. Think about what it'll be like in 10 years' time when everyone is running new mode. We won't have that concern anymore. We've just got 10 years of pain to get through to get to that new utopia. So uh, I'm willing to be outvoted on that. But personally, I find it unpleasant.
So a question regarding this, because back some minutes ago, you comment on if we look at this from the side of the client. And so here we have the smart client that wants the new mode, right? And with the new mode, we get no error bubbling, and we get proper types on the client side and a better ergonomics for the developer. But then if that's the smart client, then we have the dumb clients where basically they don't really handle the errors, or rather, maybe they want to fail fast. Like if there is an error in the response, then we don't actually care about the response because we don't want to do anything with the errors. So that's the really dumb clients. And for them, there can also be a new mode where they pass in this as part of the request saying that don't bother giving me a complex response. I just want the data or an error. So that's also a new mode, and it's a different new mode. And so again, we can change the STL here in a sense. So this new client will be able to run with a new STL, but it will run it with a new mode saying that fail fast. So then we have three modes of running, right? We have the old style where we have null bubbling, and it's basically what we have today. And then we have two new modes planned for two different kinds of clients that we kind of want everybody to jump onto. So that's the future, the addition, so to speak.
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing. So that extremely dumb client, as you call it, is essentially the same as a smart client in its needs. It doesn't want null bubbling. It just wants to know if there's errors, then it doesn't matter how many errors there are. Like if it's got an error, give up. And if it hasn't got any errors, it wants to know all of the places that will not be null if there are no errors. So it wants the exact same thing as a really smart client, except, as you say, that if any error happens, then it doesn't care anymore. So as an optimization, we could say to the server, hey, run this request in abort on error mode. And it would do the exact same thing as a new client if no errors happened, as the new mode would if no errors happened. And if any errors happened, it would just immediately return that error and this is the optimization, stop processing. Doesn't need to process the rest of the GraphQL tree, doesn't need to process any more layers or any defers or streams or whatever. It can just stop immediately and just return that error straight to the user. So I think it's interesting, but it is merely an optimization of the new mode. I think the problem is effectively that we would continue to support the traditional GraphQL mode. And I think we'll probably continue to do that indefinitely. I.e., if you don't want to use throw on error or some other local error handling mechanism, whether that be fragment based, whether it be inlining your errors as an error object, if you're not going to do that, then you want traditional mode because you want to know that a null cannot happen in this position. So I think we will support those two methods indefinitely. But this new like abort early, I think is really interesting. But I don't know whether it provides enough value to actually bother implementing.
Yeah. So the main question area is, are there any new modes where we do want the null bubbling, right? So that basically, does null bubbling provide value in the future, given that what we've learned so far by thinking about this?
I haven't thought of a use case for null bubbling outside of its current use case, which is, to be fair, the vast majority of GraphQL clients that exist today. I don't think there's a new one. If you're going to use throw an error or some other local error handling, then I don't think you want null bubbling because you want to be able to handle those errors in place. So yeah, I haven't thought of a new use case for that at all.
Cool. Anything else on this topic? Before we move on, Benji, did you have any action items for people on any of your topics?
I would love to just get some usage of it. I think by having an actual GraphQL JS implementation, this is based on GraphQL, the latest release of GraphQL 16 in JS. So you should be able to just sub it out for whatever GraphQL 16 you're already running, put it into your existing project. It should work. It does not have test suite of the new stuff, but as far as I know, it hasn't broken any of the test suite of the old stuff. So that's the main thing. It would be nice if anyone wants to spend some time writing a test suite for it. That would be great. Get it passing CI again because we're limited by code coverage right now. Combining that or using on its own GraphQL Toe, GraphQL Sock would be, I think, great. These things together give you basically a full experience, maybe not with the correct syntax, but the full like the meta, the full experience, but maybe with the wrong names of what this new thing will feel like, and then we can help to judge whether this is the right direction or not. That's the main thing. And just for a moment, if I take us on to the next topic, which honestly should be quite short, I know, Alex, you've been writing a blog post to go out on the GraphQL JS blog, the GraphQL Foundation blog. I thought it might be interesting to incorporate some of these things into that blog post because it basically gives people a way to try it now. And I'd love to have like a here's how to use it with Apollo, here's how to use it with Urkel, here's how to go and use this new feature in Relay. What are your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It might be good to have um, the people who've been working on those features for those clients write a short little blurb, and I'd be happy to add that into the blog post.
Awesome. Yeah. I think that'd be really great because it turns it into more of a community call to action and also just gets us more feedback from the community. So I think that'd be fantastic. Apollo folks, who should I be talking to about the Apollo client for web? They don't need to make any changes to Apollo client to support this. Just want someone to write something a little bit more official sounding.
I don't know, but I can ask.
Thanks, Martin.
Cool. With that, we got 15 minutes left. I'm going to move on to the syntax discussion. If nothing particularly heated or contentious comes up during this, I'm gonna run a vote on which syntax we're gonna use just on Discord, and we'll have it decided by the next working group meeting. I don't want to spend too much time on syntax. I think we've spent enough time on it.
So could I
Just
have one question before we move to that? Because I'm a bit confused regarding tooling here with the stupid clients. So if we think about basically all of the clients that can make use of the new functionality are smart clients. And most users that really invest in GraphQL, from my understanding, will use one of these new clients. We will use new tools. We will have graphical, we will have different tools that will onboard on the new stuff. So the only clients that really don't care about the schema, the SDL that will be stuck on the old stuff, they don't actually read the schema. They don't actually do introspection. So maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe I don't understand everything, but basically I'm thinking about people using curl for doing GraphQL. And they don't really look at the schema. Maybe they click around in Voyager and graphical and something to compose a query, and then they put that query into their code, and then they run that query, and they don't care about the schema anymore. Maybe that's not correct, but that's my impression, and that means that the schema, the SDL, is a programming language, kind of like any other programming language in a way. And so what we're talking about is evolving this programming language, right? And we don't need to support the old stupid clients because they don't care about this programming language. They care about the query language, and we're not talking about changing that one. Maybe this is not relevant, but that's my thought.
Yeah, the old clients like that don't need to support the SDL. You're right. Most likely when someone wrote those scripts, they would have looked into graphical, figured out which things can and cannot be null, put a relevant piece of handling in there, and probably said, check for the error property, and if it exists, then just stop. In the future, once this new mode exists, people writing similar scripts to that, I think, would use this new mode when they're doing the looking around in graphical because they want to see more banks. They want to say, like, if I'm throwing it out on errors anyway, I don't want to do null checks in any more places than I have to. So I want to use this new stuff. So the person who's writing those scripts would need to see this new syntax, but everyone else doesn't really care. One thing where the old syntax, I think, is important is in like legacy projects, anything that's using. So for example, if you're using Apollo client, you might be using it with Apollo Code Gen, or you might be using it with GraphQL Code Gen, but both of those tools look at the GraphQL SDL and they use it to generate types. And if you can't move to the newer version of those clients that does like this new throw and error behavior, or if your server doesn't support this throw and error behavior, doesn't have semantic non-null, etc., then you would still be using this older syntax. So I think it's going to be with us for a good while.
Does that answer your question, Alf? Okay.
It does, and still, I don't really. I agree completely. We need to support the old syntax. So I haven't read the spec for a while, but I remember that we had this pragma. And if you add the pragma to the file, the document, then what you're saying is basically this is the new syntax. And if you do that and your tool can't support it, then you shouldn't have added that bit. But then we say that taking like we have these converters. So basically it can be quite a simple thing to say, run this in your project and it will move you to the new syntax. It will pick up all GraphQL files and move you to new syntax. So there is a path forward here where we can help people migrate to the future if they can, but then they need tools that support the new syntax. But in 5 years' time, most tools will have this new syntax, but we still have to support the old stuff for the old stuff, right? So I'm not saying that we should drop it. I'm just saying that it will become marginal at some point. And yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And the GraphQL SOC project, semantic output conversion kit, is designed, basically it reads in a GraphQL schema, turns it from SDL, turns it into a schema using whatever the very latest version of that GraphQL package is, and then strips out the semantics and then outputs it again. So the output from that will always be a traditional schema. So whatever we go with syntax-wise, whether it's introducing question marks, whether it's adding pragmas at the top, whether it's doing an asterisk, whether it's using the double bang, doesn't matter. GraphQL SOC will be able to take in that new syntax, so long as that's the one that is officially supported, and it will be able to output a traditional syntax that can then be used with all the traditional tooling. So yes, we don't, they can be separate, and it's not strictly tied together. From my point of view, it's more if someone might see these two different schemas, like one with the pragma, one without, I don't want the educational burden to be too high on them. And that's one of the reasons that I'm keen to try and keep the unadorned type as nullable. It's one of the reasons. There are others. Which I think segues back to you, Alex.
Yes. Should be pretty quick. Quickly through this together. All right. So there are basically three syntax options on the table. The one that's currently implemented in GraphQL.js is this one that uses an asterisk. There's also one where we use a question mark for nullable and nothing for semantic non-null. And then another one where we swap the exclamation point, the bang, to be semantic non-nullable, and we use a double bang for strict non-nullable. I think I've done an all right summary here. The benefit of the asterisk is that it's better for evolution. We don't require any sort of document directive to tell the GraphQL service to interpret this piece of syntax differently than it normally would. And evolution granularity is at the field level. You just add a new piece of syntax to your field, and it's different now. The people who like this one, this is sort of pretty common syntax for nullable in other languages. They think that semantic non-nullable is going to be the most used type, so might as well make it easy to write out, fewer characters. And then this last one, it sort of indicates an escalation of danger from nullable to strict non-nullable. Benji, do you think that's an accurate summary?
Yeah, I think that's reasonably accurate. There are downsides that haven't been surfaced about them as well. So, for example, the movement from string to string asterisk to string bang in the first column is a safe migration on output types. Whereas the equivalent, it's always going to be the top row downwards that is safe. So effectively, if you start with an unadorned type, like in the middle column, then you can never, once you've pushed that to production, putting a question mark on it is no longer an option for you. Like you've already committed to this never being null. So you have to be more aware upfront of what you're doing. Whereas with the unadorned type being the safest, broadest type, you can change your mind later and make it non-nullable when you're certain that that is the case. That's another minor point.
Got it. Anything else that people feel is important about their favorite or least favorite option that they want to bring up before we run out of time here?
The other thing that I think is worth highlighting is what Stephen said earlier, which is effectively if we're living in this new world where there is effectively nullable and semantic non-nullable, and they're the only two things that exist, what syntax do we want in that new world? And that is basically those top two rows. They're the more important ones in this new mode because the third one doesn't really exist in this new world.
Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to post this to the Discord. We're going to run a poll, and then I will close the poll at the next Nullability working group meeting, and we are going to go with whichever one people pick. It's going to be by democratic vote. Cool. Any remaining questions before we wrap this up? Steven?
So just a quick question for you, Benji. On so when you convert like to strict mode with sock, uh, so when you have an asterisk, does that become a bang or does that become unadorned?
So SOC has two modes. It has semantic to nullable or semantic to strict, and you choose. So semantic to nullable would just strict the asterisks, they'll just go away. Semantic
Okay.
to strict will replace all of the asterisks with bangs.
And the semantic to and so the semantic to strict is what a would that be what a like an existing dumb client would
So
be?
an existing system would want to use the safe one to use is
Mhm.
semantic to nullable because
Right.
semantic non-null is equivalent to nullable. Technically, it can be null here, so it's nullable in old
Mhm.
speak. So stripping them out the asterisks is the correct thing to do for safety.
Okay.
But if you enable the GraphQL throw an error toe, then you will never be able to read a null from a position that is semantically or strictly non-nullable. So in that case, what you actually want to do is convert all of your semantics to be strict, because then you can take that resulting SDL and feed it into last year's GraphQL code gen that doesn't know anything about this stuff that we've been working on, and it will still give you the correct types that you want, assuming that you're using throw an error.
I see. Okay. Okay. I think I'm following you. Thank you.
Great. Anything else? We'll take that as a no. All right. Thank you all for coming. I will post the poll, and it was great seeing you. Thank you. Yeah. Later.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you,
Catch you
everyone.
next time.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.